April 1943, Tunisia. The desert wind carried the smell of burnt fuel and aluminum, the scent of a battlefield that had forgotten silence. Smoke still curled from the wreckage of a temporary American airfield near Machnesee. Crumpled hangars lay half-buried in sand, their steel ribs bent like the skeleton of a fallen creature. The Wehrmacht patrol, a group of dusty soldiers from the 10th Panzer Division, moved cautiously through the debris, boots sinking into the ash. They expected only ruins. Instead, they heard a steady mechanical heartbeat, a rhythmic hum echoing beneath the desolation. It was a generator, still running. The men froze. Corporal Franz Lenz, a mechanic from Munich, was the first to approach. He brushed away sand from the control panel and whispered, "It's alive." The others stared. The whole base was gone, yet this machine kept breathing. No cables led to the city, no power lines in sight. Lieutenant Otto Rehmer, once an electrical engineer before the war, knelt to examine it. His voice trembled with awe. "There's no external grid. They brought the entire power plant with them." The scene felt almost supernatural. The generator's fan blades turned slowly, slicing the sunlight into trembling flashes across the soldiers' faces. The engine's pulse blended with the desert wind, a reminder that even in ruin, something American still worked. A German private spat into the dust. "They fight with machines that refuse to die," he muttered. Raymer removed his gloves, pressed his hand against the hot metal, and listened to the vibration. Steady, patient, relentless. "They've built a war that moves with its own heart," he said quietly. For the first time, he understood that power, for the Allies, wasn't chained to cities or factories. It could travel. It could fly. Behind them, the sun dipped lower, igniting the sand into gold. The desert shimmered like molten glass, reflecting the metallic glow of the machine still humming through silence. The men exchanged glances. Not of victory, but unease. They had conquered an airfield, yet what they'd found inside felt like a glimpse of the next century. A sergeant tried to cut the power by flipping a switch. Nothing happened. The engine kept running, a defiance in steel. Somewhere deep inside, the motor refused to surrender. It was as if the Americans had built not just a generator, but a symbol. A machine that wouldn't stop even when its operators were gone. Raymer wiped sweat from his forehead, his gaze distant. "We build monuments that crumble," he murmured. "They build tools that survive." The desert grew quiet, save for that stubborn hum. Mechanical, eternal, and strangely human. It was the sound of a nation that had learned to make electricity march. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now in your world? The following morning, when the heat began to rise again from the dunes, the Germans gathered around the machine they had found. The metal casing shimmered like liquid mercury under the North African sun. They had decided to open its fuel compartment, believing it must be running on diesel, the same fuel that powered their Panzer engines. But what they discovered froze every hand in midair. The label on the tank read aviation fuel 100 octane. Otto Raymer whispered, "This is aircraft gasoline." The others stared, disbelieving. In their world, power for flight and power for ground equipment were separate universes, yet here was a generator that drank from the same fuel as a bomber. Franz Lenz bent closer, inhaling the faint chemical scent that rose from the tank, sharp, clean, almost sweet. He muttered, "They burned the sky to light the ground." It was more than a generator now. It was an idea. Electricity born from flight. A nation that had learned to turn its aviation surplus into power for its soldiers. For men who had spent years rationing kerosene and guarding transformer stations in Europe, the sight of such abundance was both dazzling and humiliating. The sergeant kicked the sand in frustration. "They don't even need refineries nearby," he said. "They carry their entire industry with them." Lenz ran his fingers along the fuel lines, marveling at how the hoses were insulated and marked with color-coded rings. "They thought of everything," he said. "This isn't a military afterthought. It's a factory disguised as an army." Raymer nodded slowly, eyes still on the engine's steady vibration. "They've turned logistics into strategy," he said. "Electricity, fuel, air, all moving together." He looked out toward the horizon, where the wreckage of an American B-25 still smoked. The concept struck him with chilling clarity. The Americans didn't just send bombers, they sent infrastructure. Their power followed them wherever they went, like an invisible ally that never slept. In his notebook, Reamer jotted a thought: energy without boundaries, war without pause. That afternoon, when they dismantled part of the casing to inspect the carburetor, a small engraved tag fell into Lenz's hand. Edison Electric Company in Chicago. He turned it over, smiling bitterly. They make light for cities and for killing fields alike. Silence hung heavy. The war had taught them that destruction required weapons, but now they saw a subtler truth: that victory required motion, energy, endurance. The Americans had weaponized the concept of continuity. Rimmer spoke again, his tone half admiration, half despair. They don't just have planes carrying bombs, he said. They have electricity carrying bombs. He scribbled in his log one final note for the day. Our empire collapses every time a wire breaks. Theirs begins wherever a spark is born. The men stood as the last fumes of fuel evaporated into the wind, leaving a faint, sweet ghost of flight lingering in the air. In that scent, they could smell the difference between a nation fighting for survival and one fighting with abundance. By dusk, curiosity overpowered exhaustion. The Germans had spent the day in disbelief, tracing cables, measuring voltage, sketching diagrams in the sand. Now, under a violet sky, Otto Raymer decided to do what no one else dared: restart the machine. He wiped grease from his hands, placed a firm grip on the lever, and pulled. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared back to life as if it had never been interrupted. A low growl rolled across the airfield, scattering a flock of crows from the wrecked hangars. Moments later, light burst from a headlamp still wired to the circuit. One brilliant cone of illumination cutting through the dust and ruin. The soldiers froze. The light painted the floor of the hangar gold, glimmering off broken glass, twisted girders, and the shattered nose of a P-40 fighter. Franz Lenz whispered, "Even after they lose, they still win." Raymer stood motionless, his face glowing in the reflected light. For a moment, he wasn't a soldier anymore. He was an engineer, seeing the future. "Even when the war turns off the lights," he said quietly, "they can turn them back on." The rest of the men gathered around, faces half lit, half shadowed. In that eerie glow, they looked less like conquerors and more like witnesses. The silence stretched long, broken only by the hum of the generator and the faint hiss of the desert wind. They began exploring the warehouse, guided by the resurrected beam. Inside, they found tools, welding rods, crates labeled Field Electrical Unit, Type G8. Lenz opened one and pulled out a small instruction booklet. The cover was waterproof, printed in color, and written in plain English. Even a mechanic could follow it. "They make it so anyone can understand," he murmured. "We hide knowledge behind ranks. They spread it through manuals." The men laughed bitterly. One said, "In our army, you need permission to think." Another replied, "In theirs, you need training to survive." Raymer felt the heat of the lamp against his skin, not just physical warmth, but a strange, moral warmth, as if the light carried intention. He had grown up in a Germany where power meant control, silence, and fear. But here, in the wreckage of an enemy base, he found power that illuminated rather than suppressed. He closed his eyes and thought of his son back in Dresden, of nights spent under blackout curtains, candles burning low. He wondered what it would feel like to live in a country that refused darkness, not out of defiance, but because it simply didn't need to fear the night. Outside, the generator hummed on, a heart that refused to stop beating. It became a strange companion, a witness to two worlds colliding. When the light finally flickered and died, the silence that followed was deafening. The men stood together, staring at the cooling metal, and one of them whispered, "Whoever holds the light, holds the future." Morning returned to the shattered airfield with a dry wind sweeping through the hangars. The generator, now quiet, stood like a monument to the night before. Otto Raymer crouched beside it again, his curiosity undimmed. As he followed the thick cable running away from the machine, he realized it didn't end nearby. It disappeared into the sand, vanishing toward the runway. He gestured for Franz Lenz to bring a shovel. Together, they unearthed the black cord until it surfaced again, stretching nearly 200 meters across the field. At its end, it connected to a steel junction box beside a row of grounded aircraft. Raymer brushed away sand and read the stenciled letters. Ground Power Unit, U.S. Air Force. He smiled faintly. So this is how they wake their machines, he said. They feed power to the planes before they even start their engines. Lenz blinked, trying to grasp it. You mean they use electricity to save fuel? Raymer nodded. They spend energy to preserve energy. Smart, efficient. It's not just technology, it's philosophy. The younger soldiers laughed, but uneasily. The idea felt alien. In Germany, everything had become about scarcity, rationing, substitution, survival. Here, even on a distant desert runway, the Americans had built redundancy. They could waste a little to save a lot. Raymer opened the panel and stared at the meticulous labeling. Voltage control, amp meter, fuse lock. Every component marked, every wire color-coded. He traced the system with admiration. They treat every watt as a soldier, he said. Each one knows exactly where to go. He imagined how many such units might exist across Africa, Italy, France. Small, silent veins of electricity pumping life into the Allied war machine. If each base had 10 of these generators, and each generator fed half a dozen aircraft, then one continent alone might hold hundreds of traveling power stations. The thought made him dizzy. He sat back, staring toward the sky where contrails shimmered like scars in the blue. They fight with light and air, he murmured. We fight with fear and smoke. Lenz looked at him strangely. What do you mean? Raymer pointed to the long black cable snaking between the generator and the planes. That line, he said, is more than copper. It's a bridge between two worlds, one that knows how to create, and one that only knows how to consume. The soldiers began to gather scrap, hoping to transport the generator for their own use, but Raymer stopped them. No, he said, we'll leave it here. It belongs to a future we don't yet understand. For a long time, they stood in silence, watching the desert shimmer. A single sandstorm began to crawl across the horizon, swallowing the traces of battle. The black cable trembled in the wind, stretching like a lifeline between past and progress. And somewhere deep in his mind, Raymer felt the beginning of an unwanted realization. The war they were fighting was already obsolete. By evening, the heat had softened, and the sky over Tunisia turned the color of rust. The German soldiers prepared to leave the captured airfield, but Otto Raymer insisted on examining one last thing, the control box attached to the generator's main output. It was dented, but intact. He unlatched it carefully, and when the lid swung open, the group fell silent. Inside was a miniature America. Each component bore a stamped name: Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, Pittsburgh. Capacitors, resistors, bolts, even the smallest screws, carried the identity of a city. Franz Lenz read them aloud one by one, as if reciting a prayer. Chicago Electric, Detroit Ironworks, Pittsburgh Alloy, Milwaukee Instruments. He looked up and said quietly, "They've brought their whole country to war." Raymer nodded, tracing the engraved letters with a trembling hand. Every town sends something. Every factory knows its purpose. When they fight, they don't fight alone. The younger soldiers stood watching, feeling something new, an uncomfortable respect. For years, they had been told that the German war machine was the finest on earth. But this box, filled with parts from 4 different cities, thousands of kilometers apart, spoke of something greater: cooperation. One soldier muttered, "Our factories compete, theirs collaborate." Lenz responded, "That's why their power flows without interruption. It's built on trust, not fear." The men exchanged glances. The truth was bitter. The Reich had engineers, genius inventors, perfect machines, but no unity. The Americans had built an empire of connectors, both electrical and human. Raymer looked at the names again and thought of the people behind them. Women working in Detroit assembly lines, machinists in Milwaukee, electricians in Pittsburgh. He imagined them drinking coffee, listening to swing music, tightening bolts that would travel across oceans. The generator was more than a device. It was a letter from an entire nation saying, "We are in this together." He wrote in his notebook, "Our nation builds weapons, theirs builds systems." A distant thunder rumbled. The front lines were shifting again. The men would soon retreat toward the mountains. But before leaving, Raymer closed the panel, wiped the dust from the words, "Made in USA," and whispered, It's more than a label. It's a belief. As the wind rose and dusk settled, the airfield glowed faintly in the last light of day. The soldiers knew they would likely lose this ground again within days, yet none could shake the feeling that they had witnessed something larger than war itself, a civilization powered by cooperation. The scene faded into silence, and for the first time one of them asked aloud, "Tell me, what if victory isn't about who destroys more, but about who builds together better?" What do you think, listener? In a world divided by flags, could unity itself be the strongest weapon of all? The generator was dismantled 2 days later. The captured Germans were loaded into trucks bound for the coast, then shipped to the United States under guard. Weeks later, Otto Raymer and Franz Lenz found themselves stepping onto American soil. Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, one of over 500 prisoner of war camps scattered across the country. When they entered the barracks that first night, the shock was immediate. Rows of light bulbs glowed above them, humming softly. Not flickering candles, not oil lamps, electric light, steady and warm. Raymer blinked, disoriented. They were prisoners, yet the light here burned brighter than in most German cities. "Even their prisons glow," Lenz muttered. The next morning, as they queued for breakfast, Raymer noticed something equally astonishing. The camp's kitchen ran on electric stoves. The ovens, mixers, and kettles all powered by the same unseen current that had followed him since Tunisia. On the wall, a small metal tag read "Property of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers." He asked one of the guards where the electricity came from. The man shrugged. "From the dam," he said. "The same one that powers Tulsa." Raymer stared at him. A single dam, feeding a city, a base, a prison. The scale of it made him dizzy. The Americans didn't separate war from life. They powered everything together. Later that week, he was assigned to electrical maintenance duty. When he opened the tool locker, he found a manual, Basic Electricity for Mechanics, U.S. Army Edition, 1942. The cover showed a smiling worker holding a light bulb. He flipped through its pages, simple diagrams and clean explanations. He whispered to Lenz, "They teach everyone how the world works." In their homeland, only the privileged had access to technical education. Here, even an ordinary soldier could repair a circuit or fix a generator. It was democracy written in wire. During a break, Lenz bit into a sandwich handed out by a kitchen worker, soft bread, lettuce, ham, and a slice of cheese. He chewed slowly, then said, "This meal, it's better than what our officers ate at the front." Raymer didn't reply. He was watching a group of American laborers outside, one black, one white, one Hispanic, fixing a fence together, laughing as they worked. He had been raised in a system that divided men by rank and race, but here, power flowed without hierarchy, from dam to kitchen, from worker to soldier. It made him uneasy, then thoughtful. That night, as the lights dimmed in the barracks, Raymer whispered into the dark, "We built a world where only the strong deserve light. They built one where light belongs to everyone." He turned to the wall and asked softly, as if to the unseen audience beyond it, "If you saw your enemy's world was freer, fairer, and brighter than yours, would you still believe you were on the right side?" And for the first time in the war, he had no answer. Spring, 1946. The war was over and the camps were emptying. Otto Raymer stepped off a transport train into a Germany that no longer resembled the one he had left. Dresden lay in ruins. The smell of smoke still clung to the air, though the fires had long gone cold. Factories were silent. Power lines drooped like dead veins, and whole districts stood in darkness each night because there was no electricity left to share. He walked past the broken tram tracks, through streets filled with children digging for coal dust, and thought of the desert, the generator, and the blinding light that once filled that hangar. In a small town outside Leipzig, Raymer found work repairing what little remained of the local school. They had no working generator, no bulbs, no copper wire, but among the rubble, he found a motor casing. Rusted, half-buried, but familiar. It reminded him of that American machine in Tunisia. He carried it back, cleaned it for days, and scavenged parts from bicycles and field radios. Within weeks, he had built a makeshift generator. When he finally pulled the handle, the motor stuttered, wheezed, then began to spin. A faint orange light filled the classroom, the first in that village since the war ended. Children clapped their hands. One old teacher cried silently. Raymer smiled, though his eyes were tired. "We have light again," he said. Franz Lenz, who had returned from another camp in Texas, arrived days later with a small box of American resistors he'd been allowed to take home. Together, they rewired the school, making it glow like a beacon among the ruins. One evening, Raymer stayed late, sitting by the generator as it hummed softly. In the flicker of its light, he reread his old war notebook, the one he'd filled in Tunisia. Energy without boundaries, war without pause. He turned the page and added a new line beneath it. But peace, too, needs power. He realized that what he had once seen as a weapon, the mobility of American electricity, was in fact something deeper. It was faith in motion, a belief that progress should travel wherever humans do. Years later, he would tell his students that the truest power isn't voltage or steel, but understanding, the will to rebuild rather than destroy. Machines don't keep nations alive, he said during one winter class. People who share their light do. Outside, the snow reflected the glow from the windows, pale, golden, warm. And when the village finally connected to the national grid years later, Raymer didn't dismantle his generator. He kept it in the corner of the classroom, its casing worn and pitted, a relic of a moment when he first realized defeat could also illuminate. He would sit beside it sometimes, listening to its faint echo, and remember that day in Tunisia when a group of weary soldiers found a machine that refused to die, and learned, in silence, what kind of future had already begun. When the generator in Tunisia first came to life, it was just a sound, a metallic heartbeat in the desert. Yet for the men who heard it, that pulse would follow them across oceans and years. It was more than machinery. It was a revelation. Power could travel, light could move, and a nation's strength could be measured not by its armies, but by its ability to bring electricity to any corner of the earth it touched. Otto Raymer never forgot that hum. Even decades later, when Germany rebuilt and neon lights returned to its cities, he said the memory of that sound haunted him, a reminder of a civilization that fought not only with bullets, but with brightness. He once told a student, "We thought the future was something to conquer. They taught me it's something to build." The Americans who designed those portable generators may never have known the impact of their invention. To them, it was just another field tool. But to those who witnessed it from the other side, it became a mirror, a reflection of two worlds, one obsessed with control, the other powered by collaboration. In every war, there are those who fight to destroy and those who fight to preserve, to keep a lamp lit amid the darkness. In 1943, on a forgotten airstrip in North Africa, that distinction became clear. One group saw technology as domination, the other saw it as connection. The generator, still turning beneath the smoke of battle, stood as proof that light could survive even amid ruin. It bridged continents, ideas, and ultimately, hearts. For men like Raymer and Lenz, it was the first quiet spark of understanding that the future belonged not to those who shouted the loudest, but to those who built in silence. And perhaps that is the final lesson of this story, that real power is not in the machines that roar, but in the hands that rebuild after the roaring stops. The kind of power that hums gently, lights softly, and never demands to be noticed. Maybe somewhere tonight, in a distant village or under a quiet sky, a generator hums again, not for war, but for life. And if we listen closely enough, we might still hear that same rhythm that echoed once across the desert of Tunisia, a reminder that even the smallest spark can outlast an empire.